Some stories begin in silence, when a man the world no longer notices quietly takes his seat, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful flight with his little girl. But on this day in Seat 12F, a single-dad janitor was judged, dismissed, and ignored. Until one small detail from his past shattered every assumption around him. Because sometimes the quietest man on the plane carries a sky full of secrets and the power to stop an entire Air Force base in its tracks. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartfelt healing stories that honor kindness, courage, and the quiet heroes among us, feel free to subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring more inspiring stories like this one to you every week. Now, let's begin. Harrison Vale had never cared much for the way people stared at him, but that morning, under the pale airport lights of Gate B-27, he felt every pair of eyes like small needles against his skin. Maybe it was the olive-green janitor uniform frayed at the seams and faded by years of bleach. Maybe it was the long, sun-worn hair that brushed past his shoulders. Or maybe he thought it was simply the look of a man who carried more ghosts than belongings. But beside him, clutching his hand with absolute trust, was the only reason he kept moving through the world at all. Tessa Vale, 6 years old, dressed the color of summer poppies. Eyes at once soft and ancient, like she had learned too young that life wasn't always kind. And in her small arms, held as carefully as other children held a teddy bear, was a scratched, weather-worn model of an F-22 Raptor. Its paint was chipped, its decals peeling, but she carried it everywhere, as if protecting something sacred. "Daddy, do we really get to sit in the front part today?" she asked, staring up at him as the boarding line began to move. Harrison gave her a soft, tilted smile, the one that made the corners of his tired eyes crease. "Looks like it, sweetheart." The lady at the counter said it's because they had an open veteran upgrade. Tessa nodded as if she understood the weight hidden behind that word veteran, even though Harrison had carefully shielded her from most of what it meant. She squeezed the jet tighter, then whispered almost shyly, "Mom would have loved that." Harrison's heart tightened, but he brushed a thumb over her knuckles instead of answering. Some truths were too heavy for a boarding line. They stepped onto the plane, and as they walked down the narrow aisle leading to the business class cabin, Harrison felt the shift in the air. Polite smiles stiffened. Conversations paused. Some passengers tilted their heads, eyes narrowing just enough to register confusion. What is he doing up here? Is he lost that uniform? Janitor. Really, Harrison felt every unspoken question but kept his posture easy, steady, walking the way someone walks, who refuses to be small even when the world expects him to shrink. Seat 12F, he guided Tessa into the window seat, then lowered himself into his own, with the kind of silent grace that never drew attention. Or at least it shouldn't have. But the woman in 12E was already watching him. She wore the crisp emerald dress uniform of the U.S. Army, rows of ribbons pinned to her chest with perfect symmetry. Blonde hair swept neatly into a regulation bun, features sharp, controlled, dignified, the kind of woman who carried authority like a second skin. Name tag, Hayes. V. Captain Vivian Hayes. For a brief second, Harrison thought she would simply nod politely and return to her tablet. Instead, she kept studying him. Slowly, carefully, her brow subtly drawn. Tessa noticed first. "Hi," she said softly, hugging the F-22 model to her chest. Vivian's expression softened by a measured degree. "Hello there." But as her gaze moved back to Harrison, it regained that earlier tension, something between suspicion and curiosity. It wasn't uncommon. Soldiers often recognized traces in him that civilians didn't. A straight back, an instinctive assessment of exits, reflexive calm. Things he couldn't turn off. Harrison offered a small, neutral smile. "Morning, Captain." That caught her off guard, just the faintest shift in her eyes. Then she noticed the bracelet, a steel wristband, dented, scuffed, etched with a code so discreet it could have been mistaken for a serial number. V6. Vivian's breath stilled. She knew that format. Pilot call sign designation, high tier, elite, and not something given to just anyone. But Harrison didn't notice her reaction. He was busy easing Tessa's seatbelt, brushing a loose curl behind her ear, murmuring something that made the little girl smile, despite the tension lingering in the cabin. Vivian watched the scene with unexpected hesitation. She'd boarded expecting a quiet flight, maybe a chance to catch up on reading. She did not expect to sit beside a man who seemed to contradict himself in every possible way. A janitor in a veteran priority upgrade, a working-class uniform paired with an elite pilot's bracelet, a rugged, almost intimidating exterior balanced with a gentleness toward his daughter that didn't match the story her eyes had initially written for him. She cleared her throat. "Your daughter?" "She likes jets." Harrison looked up, surprised she was speaking first. "She does. Her mom?" "Used to." He paused, his jaw tightening before he finished softly. "She loved them too." Vivian nodded slowly. She didn't ask more. The last passengers boarded. Overhead, bins slammed shut. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines hummed to life. A man across the aisle leaned toward his wife, whispering in a voice not nearly quiet enough. "I guess they'll let anyone up here now. Look at that guy, uniform's not even clean." Vivian expected Harrison to tense, or flinch, or scowl. He did none of those things. He simply rested his hand over Tessa's, grounding her before she could absorb someone else's cruelty. That calm. It wasn't normal. Not for someone being judged so openly. Not for a janitor. Vivian found herself staring once more this time, not in suspicion, but in a dawning, unsettling recognition. She had seen this kind of composure before, on the faces of men who'd been through more than anyone should. Men who moved through chaos with eerie steadiness. Men who carried worlds behind their eyes. The engines roared louder. The plane began its taxi. Vivian turned forward, but a final image lingered in her periphery. Harrison staring out the window as the runway lights streaked by the faint reflection of his steel bracelet, glinting against the glass, its engraved V6 catching the cabin's glow like a buried secret rising to the surface. Tessa leaned into him, whispering, "Daddy, do you think the sky remembers us and Harrison?" His voice, barely a breath, answered, "I think it always does." Vivian closed her eyes. For the first time in years, something in her chest stirred. Not suspicion, not duty, but a question she couldn't yet name. And the sky outside the window lifted the aircraft upward, carrying with it 3 lives destined to collide in ways none of them were ready to understand. The cabin lights softened to a warm glow as the plane leveled off above the clouds. An easy stillness settled over most passengers, but not over the man in seat 12F or the woman silently observing him from 12E. Harrison sat with a quiet composure that looked almost out of place in the business-class cabin. He wasn't scrolling his phone. He wasn't flipping through the in-flight magazine. He wasn't even pretending to rest. Instead, he kept one steady arm around Tessa, who had nestled into his side with her F-22 model resting across her lap like a small shield. But the whispers had already begun. A woman 2 rows up tilted her head toward her husband. "See his shirt. That's not a service uniform. That's what maintenance janitor." Her husband didn't lower his voice. "No way he belongs up here. They really messed up with those upgrades." Another voice chimed in from across the aisle. "He smells like cleaning chemicals. Is this really the veteran priority list?" A few passengers chuckled, not loudly but loud enough. Vivian felt something hot flare in her chest. She'd heard passengers make cruel comments before, people judging uniforms, tattoos, accents. But there was something different about this. About him. The way he sat there, absorbing every word without letting a single one touch his daughter. It was the stillness, the restraint, the quiet, insisting he didn't need to defend himself. Vivian knew that kind of stillness from somewhere, and it unsettled her. Tessa shifted suddenly, the F-22 slipping from her hands. The toy skidded into the aisle. Before Harrison could move, a middle-aged man in a pressed golf shirt stomped to his feet, blocking the flight attendant coming down the aisle. He looked down at the small jet under his loafer. "This yours," he snapped. Tessa's eyes widened. She shrank closer into Harrison's side. Harrison's expression remained calm, but Vivian noticed the way his shoulders squared instinctively, protective and controlled. He didn't speak yet. He waited as if measuring the man's next move. The passenger nudged the toy with his shoe. "You need to control your kid. This isn't economy." Vivian felt her jaw clench. Enough. She stood before she could talk herself out of it. "Sir," she said sharply. The man jerked his head toward her uniform, irritation shifting into something closer to fear. "Captain? I didn't mean I was just—" "You were speaking to a child as if she's an inconvenience," Vivian said coolly. "Pick up the toy, apologize, and return to your seat." The man blinked, color rising to his cheeks. "This isn't your Vivian," stepped 1 inch closer, voice unwavering. "Now." Silence rippled across several rows. The man bent down, stiffly retrieved the F-22, and handed it toward Harrison without meeting his eyes. "Here. No harm done." But Harrison didn't take it. Tessa did. And when she whispered, "Thank you," the man practically dove back into his seat and buckled himself in like turbulence was about to hit. Vivian exhaled slowly and returned to her seat. She wasn't sure why her heartbeat was racing, anger, adrenaline. Something more complex. She wasn't used to intervening in civilian disputes, but watching that little girl shrink in fear had pulled something fierce and primal from deep inside her. "Thank you," Harrison said softly beside her. His voice wasn't defensive or embarrassed. It was genuine, honest, a little surprised. Vivian simply nodded, eyes still fixed forward. People can be cruel without realizing it. "They usually do realize," Harrison murmured. "They just assume the person they're judging won't push back." Vivian glanced at him. The overhead light cast subtle shadows along his jawline. He looked both rugged and strangely serene, and for the first time she noticed how much older his eyes looked than his face. Eyes that had watched too many people break. "You have a calmness about you," she said before thinking. "Not many people can sit still during something like that." He shrugged lightly. "Calm is all I've got left most days." Vivian studied him more closely now, the deep grooves etched across his knuckles, the slight tremor that appeared only when he believed no one was looking, the way his breathing had stayed steady even when he'd clearly been holding back protective instinct. It didn't add up. No janitor she'd ever met carried himself like that. No civilian sat with that kind of restrained power. No ordinary man reacted to confrontation with such disciplined silence. And then there was the bracelet. V6. That single detail burned in the back of her mind. Vivian turned toward him. "Where did you get that wristband?" He hesitated, not a long hesitation, but one filled with stories he had no intention of sharing. "It was a gift," he said finally. "From whom?" He gave a small smile, the kind that hides an entire chapter of life. "Someone I used to know." Vivian wasn't convinced, but she let the subject drop. She sensed that pushing him would build a wall instead of a bridge, and she didn't know why, but she didn't want that wall. Not with him. Not with the gentle way he brushed Tessa's curls aside. Not with the steadiness that felt carved from something older, deeper. The plane hit a light patch of turbulence, causing a ripple of gasps through the cabin. Harrison instinctively placed his hand on Tessa's back, then braced his other palm against the armrest, an old reflex, precise and practiced. Vivian recognized it instantly. That wasn't how civilians braced. That was how aviators did. Her breath hitched. She wanted to ask him 100 questions. She wanted to turn him fully toward her and search his eyes. She wanted to match the puzzle pieces she'd collected so far. The upgrade from veteran priority, the composure, the reflexes, the knowledge hidden in his posture, the haunted quiet, and that call sign code. But she didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, she watched him as he whispered reassurance to Tessa and lifted the little F-22 model back into her lap, adjusting her small hands so she could hold it more securely. And Vivian, Captain. Vivian Hayes, disciplined, decorated, guarded, felt something in her chest soften in a way she couldn't stop. Because in that moment, she understood two things with absolute clarity. He wasn't who everyone assumed he was, and he wasn't who she had assumed he was either. There was something extraordinary about the man in Seat 12F, something she wasn't sure she was ready to uncover. But fate, as she'd soon learn, didn't need her readiness. It only needed time. The first sign that something was wrong came as a faint vibration beneath the floor, soft enough that most passengers would dismiss it as normal turbulence. But Harrison Vale was not most passengers. His head lifted instinctively, eyes narrowing as he listened, not to the people around him, but to the plane itself. To the tone of the engines, the shift in pressure, the subtle drop in pitch that didn't belong. Beside him, Vivian Hayes felt it too, though less clearly. Aviators learn to pay attention to air, to sound, to balance. But whatever Harrison heard, he heard it first. The captain's voice broke over the intercom, calm but tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical issue. Nothing to be alarmed about. Please remain seated as we evaluate the situation." But the cabin had already changed. People stiffened. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The business class quiet turned into the silence of held breaths. Tessa clutched her F-22 model a little too hard. "Daddy, what's happening?" Harrison rested his hand gently over hers. "Just a little bump, sweetheart. Like when the wind pushes the swings." Another vibration rattled the cabin, this time unmistakable. A jolt ran through the fuselage, followed by a faint metallic groan. The flight attendants exchanged looks that were anything but calm. Vivian's instincts flared. She reached toward her seatbelt, tightening it with a sharp tug. "That wasn't minor," she murmured. Harrison's eyes stayed forward, focused, listening with frightening precision. "Hydraulics," he whispered under his breath. "Rear actuator. Left side." Vivian turned slowly toward him. How could you possibly know that Harrison didn't answer? His jaw flexed with a quiet tension, one that said he wasn't guessing. Another announcement came this time, clipped and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, for precautionary reasons, we will be diverting to the nearest safe landing point. Please remain calm. Cabin crew prepare for emergency protocol." Someone gasped. A woman in row 11 began to pray under her breath. Overhead bins trembled slightly as the aircraft dipped. Tessa's breathing grew fast and shallow. "Daddy, I'm scared." Harrison gathered her into his arms, anchoring her tiny body against his chest. "It's okay. Feel my breathing. Match it with yours." Vivian watched, stunned, as the little girl's panicked breaths slowly synced with her father's steady rhythm. "I don't understand," Vivian said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rising tension. "How are you so calm right now?" Harrison kept one hand resting on Tessa's back, the other gripping the armrest, not with fear, but with the control of a man who'd done this before, many times in a different life. When the plane lurched again, Vivian instinctively reached for the armrest too, but her fingers brushed against Harrison's instead. A shock went through her, sudden and inexplicable. His hand was warm, strong, steady. Too steady. The aircraft's descent began a slow, careful lowering of altitude. Outside the windows, clouds churned like shifting gray walls. The intercom crackled. "We will be making an emergency landing at Fort Stockton Air Force Base. Please follow all crew instructions." Vivian's eyes shot to Harrison. She saw something flash across his face, recognition. Memory. Pain. "An airbase," she whispered. "That's not a typical divert point for civilian flights." "It is," Harrison said softly. "If the plane needs a long runway, or if the malfunction could affect landing gear." She stared. "You shouldn't know that." But Harrison wasn't listening anymore. His gaze was distant, fixed not on the cabin, but on something deep inside himself. A familiar battlefield, a sky from years ago. Vivian felt her heartbeat quicken. "You used to fly, didn't you?" Harrison exhaled through his nose, quiet, resigned. "Long time ago." Before she could press further, the plane dipped sharply. A chorus of screams tore through the cabin. Drink cups toppled. A laptop slid off a tray. Tessa buried her face in Harrison's chest, trembling so violently that Vivian instinctively reached out and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "I've got you, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're right here." Harrison looked at Vivian, really looked at her for the first time. And in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Trust. Recognition. A shared understanding of danger. The kind only people with service backgrounds could truly recognize in one another. The plane shuddered violently again, making loose items rattle overhead. Vivian gripped the seat in front of her. "This isn't a standard systems error. Something's wrong." Harrison nodded once. "It's manageable, as long as the pilot doesn't." A piercing alarm chimed from the cockpit, loud enough to echo through the entire cabin. Passengers screamed. Vivian sucked in a breath. "Panic," Harrison finished. The engines shifted to a descending pitch as the landing sequence initiated. Outside, the world of clouds fell away, revealing long expanses of dusty Texas landscape, and in the distance, the unmistakable outline of hangars and runways. Fort Stockton Air Force Base. Vivian had never landed here before, but she knew its reputation. Wide landing strips, emergency-capable crews, specialized response units. "This is good," she said more to herself than anyone else. "This is where you want to be when something goes wrong." Harrison didn't reply. The wheels touched down with a bone-jarring force. A collective cry rippled through the plane. Oxygen masks shook in their compartments. The wings wobbled violently as the hydraulics fought to stabilize. Harrison's hand never left Tessa. Vivian's never left the armrest. And for one breathless moment, the world felt like it might tear apart. Then finally, the plane slowed. A long exhale swept through the cabin like a single relieved sigh. But Harrison didn't relax. He was listening again. And when he spoke, his voice was so low Vivian barely heard him. That wasn't luck. Vivian turned to him. "What?" He didn't meet her eyes. That landing. The pilot didn't panic. He compensated manually. You only learn that after years of combat flight drills. Vivian's skin prickled. "How do you?" Then she stopped, because she already knew the answer. Harrison Vale wasn't a janitor who used to fly. He was a pilot who had been forced to become something else. Vivian watched him for a long moment, unable to shake the certainty settling over her like a cold shadow. This man was far more than he let the world believe. And soon, very soon, she would discover just how much of the sky he once belonged to. The emergency vehicles were already lined up along the runway as the aircraft rolled to a slow, trembling halt. Fire crews, medics, and base personnel stood poised in crisp formation, an image of disciplined readiness against the sweeping Texas wind. Through the oval windows, sunlight glinted off their helmets and the metallic bodies of military trucks. Inside, the passengers slowly uncoiled themselves, from fear murmuring shaky prayers, unbuckling seatbelts with trembling hands. But the tension hadn't fully broken. It clung to the air like static, an invisible residue of the terror they'd just survived. Harrison Vale remained seated for a long moment, one hand still on Tessa's shoulder, his gaze distant and unreadable. He was listening again, listening not to the plane, but to the echoes of something he had tried to bury. Vivian Hayes watched him carefully, her heartbeat still unsettled from the descent. She had seen soldiers hold themselves together under fire, but none held themselves with the silent, unshakable gravity she sensed in him. When the doors finally opened, warm desert air rushed into the cabin, carrying the sharp scent of asphalt and jet fuel. Passengers filed out, shaky but relieved, greeted by medics checking pulses and offering bottles of water like small lifelines. Harrison lifted Tessa into his arms as they disembarked. She clung to him, head tucked beneath his chin, her little fingers gripping the fabric of his uniform. Vivian walked just behind them, keeping a watchful eye, not out of duty, but out of something else she didn't want to name yet. They stepped into the waiting area of the airbase terminal, a space lined with old mission patches, faded photographs of fighter squadrons, and a large American flag that hung proudly above the entrance. Harrison paused for half a second, eyes lingering on the flag longer than he intended. Vivian saw it. That look, not reverence, not nostalgia, but grief shaped like memory. Before she could ask anything, a sudden shift in the room pulled both their attention. 3 uniformed pilots strode through the doors. F-22 pilots, not rookies, not trainees. These men carried themselves with sharp, controlled confidence, the kind forged in years of elite training. Their flight suits bore patches that only a rare fraction of aviators ever earned. The insignia on their shoulders read, Elite Command, the most advanced air superiority unit in the region. Vivian straightened instinctively, her spine tightening with respect. But it was nothing compared to the reaction that broke over the 3 pilots' faces the moment they saw Harrison. The tallest of them, broad-shouldered sandy hair, eyes sharp as polished steel, stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught audibly enough that his companions turned toward him in confusion. Lieutenant Colonel, one of them murmured, but Vaughn Turner didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on Harrison Vale. His expression had shifted into something raw, recognition, shock, and something close to reverence. Vivian glanced between them, confusion tightening her brow. Do you know him? But the question didn't need answering. Vaughn Turner took one slow step forward, then another. The other 2 pilots followed, every muscle in their bodies rigid with disbelief. When Vaughn reached Harrison, he stopped barely a foot away. His voice dropped to a hushed, trembling whisper. Sir, that bracelet, is that? He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Harrison's hand went instinctively to the steel band resting on his wrist. For a moment, he seemed ready to cover it, to hide it, as he'd done for years. But Tessa shifted in his arms, lifting her head, and Harrison didn't move to conceal it. Vaughn swallowed hard. Viper 6. The room fell silent. The medics stopped talking. Flight attendants froze in place. Even the hum of the airbase seemed to dim. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. V6. Viper 6. That wasn't just any call sign. It was a legend. A pilot whose maneuvers were still taught in simulation rooms. A tactician whose last mission 7 years earlier had become a subject of whispered stories among aviators. A man who disappeared from the Air Force with no official explanation. And now he stood in front of her, in a janitor's uniform. Harrison exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with years he'd never intended to explain. "That was a long time ago," he murmured. "I'm not." But Vaughn didn't let him finish. He stepped back and snapped to full rigid attention. Then he saluted. A sharp, formal, flawless salute. Not to a janitor, not to an old veteran, but to a superior officer. To a legend. The other two pilots followed instantly, saluting with equal respect, their eyes filled with something between awe and sorrow, like they were saluting a ghost who'd returned to life. The entire terminal watched. Vivian stood rooted in place, heart pounding as the truth rearranged itself inside her chest. Harrison Vale, the man she'd judged in silence, the man the passengers had mocked, the man who'd held his daughter with more tenderness than most men held their own. Pride was someone else entirely. Someone extraordinary. Tessa looked at her father, confusion blossoming across her face. "Daddy." "Why are they doing that?" Harrison met his daughter's eyes, the pain and humility in his expression, merging into something so human it hurt to look at. "Because he whispered a long time ago. I flew with them." Vaughn lowered his salute, clearing his throat sharply. "Sir, we thought you were gone. We heard stories, rumors. After the accident, after your disappearance," Harrison cut him off gently. "I didn't disappear. I just stepped out of the sky." Vivian felt a sharp sting in her chest. A man doesn't fall from the sky. He chooses to land. Or he's forced down. And she suddenly understood Harrison had been both. Vaughn nodded stiffly, emotion tightening his face. "It's an honor to see you again, sir." Harrison didn't respond with pride or acceptance, only with a quiet, almost painful humility. "You shouldn't salute me," he said softly. "I'm not that man anymore." Vaughn's voice cracked. "With respect, sir. You'll always be Viper 6. The words hung in the air heavy and electric. Vivian looked at Harrison, really looked at him. And in that moment, she knew everything. She thought she knew about the man in 12F was only the shadow of the truth. And she wasn't even close to uncovering the whole story. The commotion inside the airbase terminal slowly dispersed, leaving behind a charged silence that clung to the air like static. A few passengers whispered among themselves, but most simply watched, unable to look away from the strange, almost sacred scene they had just witnessed. Harrison Vale, quiet, worn dressed in a janitor's uniform, had been saluted by elite F-22 pilots. Not thanked, not greeted. Saluted. Tessa clung to his neck, her large eyes flicking between her father and the men who seemed overwhelmed by seeing him. Vivian Hayes stood just a step behind her heartbeat, a steady thrum in her ears. Everything she thought she understood about this man had cracked wide open. After a respectful pause, Vaughn Turner, the highest-ranking pilot among the trio, cleared his throat. "Sir, if you're willing, we'd like to escort you somewhere more private." Harrison hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I'm not here for attention. I'm just waiting for instructions on the connecting flight." Vaughn exchanged a glance with his wingman, who nodded subtly. "We understand. But the base commander will want to know you're here." His voice softened. "Please, sir." The request wasn't an order. But it held weight. Harrison sighed, not in defeat, but in resignation. "Fine. A few minutes." Tessa looked worried. Harrison brushed her cheek with his thumb. "It's all right, honey. We're not going far." Vivian stepped closer. "If you'd like, I can come with you. Just to make sure you're comfortable." She meant it sincerely, though she wasn't entirely sure why she felt compelled to be near him. Maybe it was the way he bore everything alone. Maybe it was the weight behind his quietness, something she recognized from her own darkest corners. Harrison gave her a small, grateful nod. They followed Vaughn into a quiet corridor, lined with framed photographs of past squadrons. Some images were crisp and fresh, others were faded by time and sunlight. Harrison's eyes drifted across them, lingering on the faces of pilots, whose names he once knew, whose laughter had filled hangars, whose fates had carved themselves into his memory. Vivian noticed his expression shift, subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't just remembering, he was hurting. They entered a small debriefing room, clean, sparse. A single table sat in the center. Tessa curled into a chair, hugging her F-22 model like a talisman. Vaughn closed the door quietly, then turned toward Harrison. "I still can't believe you're here," he said, voice thick. "After what happened, we thought we'd never see you again." Vivian's eyes snapped toward Harrison. What did happen? For the first time, Harrison didn't look away. He didn't hide. He didn't deflect. He simply sat down, rested his forearms on his knees, and spoke. "My wife," he said softly. "She was an F-22 pilot, too. Sharp, brave. Better than me in ways I could never admit until it was too late." Vivian felt her breath catch. Vaughn lowered his gaze respectfully. "We were flying a joint exercise," Harrison continued. "High altitude. Weather was clean. Then her jet got caught in a power surge from a failing line. Instruments went blind. She lost control." His voice quivered just enough for Vivian to feel the tremor in her own chest. "I tried to guide her down," he whispered. "But the systems didn't respond. She fought it. God, she fought it. She was the strongest pilot I ever knew." He swallowed hard. "But the jet hit the ridge. I saw the fireball. His hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. I lost her in less than 6 seconds." Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Vivian's throat tightened. She had heard stories like this. Pilots lost families shattered, but hearing it from him, watching the grief live behind his eyes, it was different. It was intimate. It was raw. Tessa slid down from her chair and walked to Harrison, placing her small hands on his knees. He lifted her into his lap, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "I didn't know how to be anything anymore," he murmured. "Not a pilot. Not a husband. All I had left was being a father. So I quit. Vanished. Took whatever job let me stay close to Tessa and far away from noise and sky." Vivian felt something deep and painful unfurl in her chest. She didn't try to hide it. "You didn't vanish," she said quietly. "You survived. In the only way you knew how." Harrison lifted his eyes toward her. They were tired, hollow, but also strangely full, as if he'd been waiting years to hear someone say those words. Vaughn stepped forward, voice steady but emotional. "Sir, we respected your decision. Losing a partner in the air it's the kind of grief most people can't survive. But you did. And you took care of your daughter." He paused, swallowing thick emotion. "That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing a man can do." Harrison didn't answer, but something softened inside him, something unspoken, fragile, and important. Vivian watched him closely. She wasn't seeing a legend anymore. She wasn't seeing a janitor. She wasn't seeing a broken pilot. She was seeing a man holding together 2 worlds, the one he lost and the one he still needed to protect. And she felt an ache in her chest. She hadn't expected admiration tinged with something deeper, warmer, something she wasn't ready to name. Tessa looked up at Vivian. "Miss V, Daddy cries at night sometimes. He thinks I don't know." Vivian's heart broke cleanly. Harrison closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. "Sweetheart, it's okay," Tessa whispered, hugging him tighter. "I cry too. I miss Mommy." Vivian had survived deployments, burial ceremonies, folded flags handed to widows. But nothing, not explosions, not final salutes, not battlefield goodbyes hit her the way this tiny confession did. She leaned closer, her voice gentle. You don't have to be alone in that grief, either of you. Harrison looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Part gratitude, part vulnerability, part something quietly blossoming, something that scared her, something that scared him too. But neither of them pulled away. For the first time since she boarded that plane, Vivian Hayes realized she was no longer merely observing a man with secrets. She was being invited slowly, carefully into the shadowed places he'd locked away. And somehow, she wanted to walk with him into the light. The afternoon sun over Fort Stockton Air Force Base was a stark, unfiltered gold, a color that softened nothing. It poured across the runway in blinding sheets reflected off hangar doors and wrapped the parked fighter jets in a shimmering heat haze. The air smelled of dust jet fuel and the kind of quiet that only existed in places where life and danger coexisted tightly. Harrison Vale stepped onto the tarmac with Tessa's small hand curled into his. Vivian Hayes walked to his right, her stride confident and steady, though her eyes kept drifting toward him with an expression she couldn't quite suppress, a fragile mixture of concern, admiration, and something that almost looked like longing. Ahead of them, Vaughn Turner and the two elite command pilots cut a sharp path toward a row of F-22 Raptors gleaming under the sun. It wasn't a tour. It wasn't a ceremony. It felt more like a homecoming that no one had expected. Tessa gasped softly, her grip tightening. "Daddy." Look, the F-22 stood like a sleeping beast, sleek, angular, powerful. Its dark canopy reflected the entire sky. Harrison's steps slowed, then stopped entirely. His eyes locked onto the aircraft with an intensity that made Vivian inhale sharply. He wasn't just looking at a jet. He was remembering one. Vaughn noticed the stillness and approached him gently. We thought it might mean something to you to see her. Same model. Same configuration." Harrison's voice was barely audible. She was flying one just like this. Vivian glanced at him, her chest tightening. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved across the runway like a long breath. Then, from the side of the hangar, a young female crew chief stepped forward. Sergeant Lana Brooks. Tall, confident, grease streaked across her arm, she stopped mid-stride when she recognized Harrison. Her voice cracked. "No way. Is that really you?" Harrison offered a small, humble nod. "Hello, Brooks." Vivian blinked. She knew him too. Brooks jogged closer, eyes glossy. "I can't believe this. You saved my brother. The training accident. The power failure at altitude. He said he only lived because you talked him through it." Harrison looked surprised. "Your brother was Damon Brooks." "Yes, sir." Her voice wavered with emotion. "He still tells that story. Says Viper 6 was the only reason he made it home." Harrison's jaw worked. As he looked away, the memories landing heavy on his shoulders. Vivian moved a step closer, almost without thinking, and gently rested a hand on his arm. He stiffened slightly but didn't pull away. "Dad," Tessa whispered, tugging his sleeve. "It looks like your plane." Harrison knelt beside her. "A lot like it, honey." "Does it make you sad?" Her voice was too soft, too pure. Harrison closed his eyes, inhaling deeply through his nose before answering. "Not sad. Just remembering." Tessa nodded, accepting the answer in the way only children could, because they didn't need full explanations, just honesty. Vaughn motioned toward the jet. "If you're up for it, sir." "She's open." "You can take a look." Harrison hesitated. Vivian held her breath. She sensed deeply what it meant for him to even consider stepping back toward the machine that had given him life and taken it away. But slowly, Harrison nodded. He approached the F-22. His fingertips brushed the cool metal near the intake. His reflection rippled faintly across the gray surface, distorted by the subtle waves of heat. Vivian followed him, her own heartbeat unexpectedly fast. She had always respected aircraft, respected what they symbolized. But now standing beside Harrison, the jet seemed to carry the weight of his entire past. "What does it feel like?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. His hand remained on the jet's fuselage. "Like meeting someone I used to be." Vivian felt something sink inside her chest, a deep, resonant ache for a man who had lived through more than he ever said aloud. Harrison's foot touched the bottom rung of the access ladder, but instead of climbing into the cockpit, he paused. His shoulders trembled, barely noticeable, but Vivian caught it. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to prove anything. Not to them. Not to me." Harrison turned his head toward her, and their eyes met. There was gratitude in his gaze, and pain so deep she felt herself pulled toward him without permission. "I'm not proving anything," he said quietly. "I'm just saying goodbye in a way I never did." Vivian's lips parted, words lost in her throat. Then, unexpectedly, Tessa climbed 2 steps of the ladder and touched the side of the cockpit. "Daddy, it's warm." Harrison inhaled sharply, steadied himself, then climbed the ladder behind her, keeping one arm around her waist. Together they looked into the dark, reflective canopy. Vivian watched from below, and in that moment, she saw 2 worlds merge in the reflection the hardened aviator Harrison once was, and the gentle father he had become. Brooke spoke softly, her voice reverent. "We never forgot you, sir. Nobody did. You were a legend." Harrison closed his eyes. "Legends don't break," Vaughn answered quietly from behind him. "The strongest ones do." Vivian felt tears burn behind her eyes, unexpected, unwelcome, but undeniable. Harrison finally stepped down from the ladder, lifting Tessa into his arms. His face was calmer now, more resolute, as though something inside him had untangled. Vivian walked beside him as they moved further along the runway. When their hands brushed by accident, neither of them pulled away this time. There was no declaration, no confession, just a silent acknowledgement. Something was growing between them, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. As they walked, a stray wind swept across the runway, lifting a few strands of Harrison's long hair and brushing them across Vivian's shoulder. She didn't move away. He didn't apologize, and the sky above, vast, open, endlessly quiet, seemed to hold its breath. Because for the first time since losing everything, Harrison Vale was taking a step, just one back toward life. The hum of the jet engines felt different on the return flight, quieter, steadier, almost gentle compared to the chaos they'd left behind at Fort Stockton. Passengers spoke in hushed voices, eyes still carrying the shadow of fear, but softened now by relief. It was the peculiar calm that settles only after people have brushed close to danger and walked away intact. Harrison Vale settled into seat 12F once more. Tessa rested against him, exhausted in the pure, honest way only children could be. She held her F-22 loosely in one hand, thumb tracing the worn decals, the way she used to trace her mother's dog tags when she was younger. Across from them, Captain Vivian Hayes lowered herself into 12E with a sigh. She wasn't exhausted, not physically, but there was a weight inside her ribcage she didn't quite know how to name. Something had shifted in her today. Something internal, quiet, profound. "Is she asleep already?" she whispered. Harrison nodded. "She falls asleep faster after she's scared. Happened ever since." He stopped. Pain flickered through his eyes. Ever since her mom, Vivian, finished softly. He gave a small nod. Not ashamed, just tired of carrying grief alone. Vivian looked at Tessa's peaceful face, then at Harrison's, so much older than his years, so much gentler than the world ever gave him credit for. She felt a tug in her chest she wasn't expecting. "You did good today," she murmured. "You kept her calm when half the cabin was losing it." Harrison's lips curved barely. I used to be good at keeping an entire squadron steady during emergencies. One child seems easy in comparison. Vivian swallowed, studying him closely. You were trained to keep grown men alive. They depended on you. And yet, he said, quietly, brushing a strand of hair from Tessa's cheek, she's the only one I was ever truly afraid of losing. The honesty in those words reached into Vivian's chest like a warm hand, unsteadying her in a way she hadn't anticipated. For a moment, neither spoke. The flight attendant passed, offering warm towels. Vivian took one. Harrison didn't. You don't like the towels? She asked, half teasing. He chuckled softly, a sound she hadn't heard from him yet. It was warm, surprising, a little rough at the edges, like he wasn't used to laughing out loud anymore. It's not that he said. They're just too fancy. Doesn't fit with my janitor reputation. Vivian raised a brow. That's not who you are. Harrison studied her face. Funny. You're the first person who said that to me in years. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Because it's true. People will judge what they see. Uniforms, jobs, appearances. But those things don't define a person's worth. Harrison tilted his head, looking at her with something like quiet amusement and something deeper. I misread you earlier, she continued, her voice low. When we first sat down. I thought you were... She stopped, ashamed of the assumption she had made. A mess, he offered gently. No, she said firmly. Just someone who'd stopped trying. He didn't defend himself. He didn't bristle. He simply asked. And what do you think now? Vivian swallowed. The truth felt heavy but necessary. I was wrong, and I hate that I judged you without knowing anything about you. You weren't wrong to make assumptions, he said. People see what they want to see. But I don't want to be one of those people, Vivian whispered. Not with you. The meaning hung between them, raw, tentative, impossible to ignore. Harrison exhaled slowly, something almost fragile in the movement. I've gotten used to being invisible, he said quietly. It's safer that way. Vivian shook her head. You're not invisible, Harrison. Her voice softened. You walked into a room today, and 3 elite pilots couldn't breathe when they saw you. He looked away, as though the memory brought more discomfort than pride. That's a part of my life I can't go back to, I know, Vivian said. But that doesn't erase who you were, or who you are now. A long silence settled, but not an uncomfortable one. Tessa shifted in Harrison's lap, then, still half asleep, leaned her small head onto Vivian's shoulder instead of his. Harrison froze. Vivian did too. Then something warm and unexpected unfurled inside both of them, something gentle enough to scare them more than any turbulence ever could. She likes you, Harrison said, his voice barely audible. Vivian smiled, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. I like her too. She's special. She reminds me of her mother, Harrison whispered. Same heart, same curiosity, same strength. Vivian's tone softened. I'm glad she has you. I don't always know if I'm enough, he admitted. Vivian turned toward him fully now. Harrison, you are more than enough. You're raising her with love and steadiness. That's more than most kids ever get. His eyes lingered on her, searching for any trace of pity. There was none. Only sincerity. Only warmth. Only a tenderness he hadn't felt directed at him in a long, long time. You're kind, he murmured. I'm honest, she replied. The plane dipped gently into its cruising descent, and the cabin lights dimmed further. The world outside the windows was a soft blanket of clouds, tinted with the late afternoon sun, glowing like quiet embers. Vivian looked down at Tessa, still resting peacefully against her, and something inside her chest shifted. It wasn't duty. It wasn't admiration. It was something warmer, something terrifying, something she had never allowed herself to feel for anyone in uniform, and certainly not for a man who carried the wounds of the sky in his eyes. She whispered, barely audible, "I don't want to be someone who misjudges you again." Harrison's voice was equally soft. "And I don't want to be someone who shuts the door on people trying to understand me." Their eyes met. There in the quiet after the storm, below the hum of engines, beneath the weight of everything unsaid, something delicate and undeniable began to grow. Not fast, not dramatic, but real, and neither of them moved away. The plane glided through the final stretch of descent wings, angling gently as the city below unfolded in a soft patchwork of lights. Evening had begun its quiet takeover, the sky streaked with a fading orange that dissolved into deeper shades of blue. A sense of calm washed over the cabin, the kind that comes after surviving something frightening and finding one's feet again. Tessa slept deeply, her small body warm against Vivian's shoulder. And though Vivian sat perfectly still, she felt anything but. There was something indescribably intimate about the moment, the weight of a child trusting her enough to sleep on her, the man sitting beside her, watching with eyes filled not with jealousy, but with a kind of humble gratitude. Harrison Vale wasn't looking out the window anymore. He wasn't tracing the bracelet on his wrist. He wasn't lost in the past. He was watching them, and his expression held something she wasn't prepared for. Something gentle, something hopeful, something alive. Vivian's breath caught in her throat when she realized it. Harrison wasn't looking at her with curiosity or politeness or simple appreciation. He was looking at her like she was peace he had forgotten existed. The landing gear touched the runway with a soft thud, smoother than the emergency descent they had endured hours earlier. A collective exhale rippled through the passengers. People unbuckled belts and shuffled with the anticipation of getting home. Harrison brushed a hand over Tessa's back. "We're here, honey," he whispered. Tessa stirred, eyes fluttering open. When she saw Vivian still beside her, she smiled sleepily. "Miss V, are we going to see you again?" The question froze both adults. Vivian felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "Well, if your dad wants that too." Tessa looked to Harrison with a hopeful little grin, one that pierced through layers of grief he didn't realize still weighed on him. Harrison began, then faltered. Vivian waited, heart tightening a bit more. With each second, he stayed silent. Harrison swallowed hard, his voice quieter when he continued. "I don't really socialize much anymore." Vivian offered a gentle smile. "I figured that out. I'm not the easiest person to be around," he added. She shook her head. "I don't believe that." Why Vivian held his gaze without flinching. "Because I spent the last several hours beside you, and I didn't want to be anywhere else." The admission stunned them both. Tessa blinked, then whispered exactly what Harrison was too shaken to say aloud. "Daddy, I want to see her again too." Harrison stared at the carpeted floor for a moment, thinking, weighing, fearing, wanting. He had spent so long building walls around his heart that the idea of letting someone in felt as dangerous as stepping back into the sky. But he wasn't the only one who'd lost something in life. And in Vivian's eyes, he saw a familiar ache, a loneliness shaped differently but just as real. He exhaled shakily. "If you're open to it, we'd like that." Vivian's smile softened into something warm and unexpectedly tender. "I'd like that too." By the time the plane reached the gate and passengers began filing out, the world outside had dimmed into a quiet twilight. Harrison lifted Tessa into his arms with ease. Vivian walked beside them through the jet bridge, aware of the unusual sense of rightness in their steps. No awkwardness, no strain. Just three people moving together as if they had done it many times before. Inside the terminal, Vivian stopped and turned to face them. "Well," she said, trying to steady her voice. "This is where we say goodnight, I suppose." Tessa immediately pouted. "No." "Miss V, you said we could see you again." Vivian chuckled. "I did. But not on the jet bridge, sweetheart." Then she looked up at Harrison. That's when her pulse quickened. His eyes were on her dark, tired warm. Not intense, but earnest. So earnest it rooted her to the floor. There were no medals between them now. No uniforms. No salutes. Just two human beings standing in the quiet glow of an airport terminal holding the weight of everything left unspoken. Vivian cleared her throat. "So, if you'd like, you can call me. Or text me." Harrison's lips curved slightly. "Is that your way of asking for my number?" "Captain Hayes?" She laughed, short, nervous reel. "I'm trying to be subtle." He shook his head. "Subtlety isn't necessary with me." Vivian felt her heart thump once sharply. Before she could respond, Tessa leaned toward Harrison's ear and whispered loudly, "Daddy, ask her now." Before she runs away. Vivian burst out laughing. Harrison groaned, softly rubbing his forehead. "She's persistent." "Smart kid," Vivian said. "Takes after someone." Harrison's cheeks warmed at the compliment, though he tried to hide it. Finally, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and handed it to Vivian. "Here." Before she stages a mutiny, Vivian typed her number in, handed it back, and tried to hide the tremor in her hand. This wasn't just exchanging contact information. This was opening a door neither of them thought they would ever approach again. When she looked up, Harrison was watching her with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For this. For being here. For staying beside us." Vivian swallowed. "I didn't stay because I had to, Harrison. I stayed because I wanted to." For the first time since she met him, Harrison didn't fight the softness that entered his eyes. He embraced it. And in that moment, in the quiet corner of a dimming airport, a door that had been locked for years creaked open inside both of them. Not wide, not recklessly. Just enough for hope to slip through. As Vivian stepped backward, she placed a hand on Tessa's shoulder. "Good night, sweetheart." "Good night, Miss V," Tessa murmured. Then Vivian shifted her gaze to Harrison. "Good night, Harrison." "Good night, Vivian." Their voices were soft, almost tender, almost something more. Vivian walked away, slowly resisting the urge to look back. Harrison watched her until she disappeared into the sea of travelers. Only then did he let out a long, trembling breath. He didn't know what this was. He didn't know where it would lead. But for the first time in years, he wanted to find out. The next few days unfolded in a way Harrison Vale hadn't experienced in years. Quiet, steady, and strangely full. Life in his small rental duplex usually followed a familiar rhythm, early morning shifts at the school. Simple lunches packed for Tessa dinner at the tiny wooden table she insisted on decorating with stickers, bedtime stories. Read with a voice that wavered some nights more than others. But after the return flight, something subtle had changed in the air around them. Vivian Hayes kept her promise. It started with a text on the first morning. "Vivian, just checking in. How's Tessa? How are you?" Harrison stared at the message for a full minute. He wasn't used to anyone asking how he was, not sincerely, not without expectation. He typed slowly. "Harrison. We're okay. Tessa slept through the night. Thank you." The conversation should have ended there, but it didn't. "Vivian. Good. Tell her Miss V says hi, and tell her I still owe her a hot chocolate." Harrison shook his head, smiling despite himself. He didn't reply, but somehow his morning felt lighter. Later that afternoon, after Harrison picked Tessa up from school, she hopped into the passenger seat and immediately asked Daddy, "Can we see Miss V today?" He blinked. "Sweetheart, she's probably busy." His phone buzzed. "Vivian, if you two are free, I'm at the park by the lake. I brought snacks." Tessa squealed before Harrison could even read the rest. So they went. They found Vivian sitting on a wooden bench near the water uniform replaced with a soft navy sweater and jeans. She looked different out of uniform. Younger, softer, almost luminous in the golden light. Tessa ran to her first. Miss Vivian opened her arms, laughing as the little girl barreled into her like a tiny rocket. "There's my brave girl." Harrison approached more slowly, unsure if he was intruding on something precious or stepping into something new. Vivian met his eyes. "Hi." He exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Hi." They walked together along the lake's edge. Tessa skipped ahead of them, humming her F-22 model swinging from her hand. Vivian glanced at Harrison. "She seems happy." "She is. She hasn't stopped smiling since the flight." "Maybe she feels safe," Vivian suggested quietly. He looked at her. "With you?" "Yes." Vivian's steps faltered, warmth rising in her face. "I didn't mean I know," he said gently. "But it's true." They shared a long silence, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. The kind of silence that exists only between two people who trust each other enough not to fill every space with noise. As the sun dipped lower, they settled into the grass beneath a sprawling oak. Vivian unpacked a few snacks. She'd brought fruit crackers, juice boxes, even a tiny bag of gummy bears. Tessa's eyes lit up like she'd been handed a treasure map. "Daddy Miss V knows all my favorite snacks," Vivian laughed. "I guessed." "You guessed all of them," Tessa said, astonished. Harrison stole a sideways glance at Vivian. She shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I used to buy the same things for my niece." The soft confession pulled something in his chest. "I didn't know you had family nearby." "I don't," Vivian said quietly. "My sister's deployed. I help when I can, but I'm alone most days." For a moment, Harrison didn't know what to say. He saw it now, the loneliness tucked neatly behind her professional composure, the silence she carried like an invisible rucksack. "You don't have to be alone," he murmured. "Not anymore." Vivian looked away, eyes shimmering briefly. "Same goes for you." Their words hovered in the air like fragile threads waiting to be tied. Over the next hour, Tessa showed Vivian how her F-22 could do tricks, which was really just Tessa spinning in circles with the toy. Vivian clapped and cheered like it was an airshow performance. Harrison watched them with a tenderness that startled him. The way Vivian crouched to Tessa's level, the way she listened fully when the child spoke, the way she glanced over at Harrison often, as though checking if he was comfortable, included at ease. He hadn't felt this kind of warmth in years, and he didn't know how to handle it. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the sky turned a soft lavender. Tessa grew sleepy, curling against Harrison on the picnic blanket. Her eyelids drooped. Vivian lowered her voice. "She's fading fast. She always does after a big day." Vivian shifted closer. "Harrison, can I ask you something?" He braced himself gently. "Go ahead." "Earlier you said you weren't sure if you were enough. As a father," her eyes softened, "do you really believe that he stared at his hands? Some days I wake up and wonder if she'd be better off with someone whole." Vivian took a slow, deliberate breath. "You may think you're broken, but that little girl looks at you like you hang the moon. She doesn't need someone perfect. She needs someone who loves her enough to stay." He swallowed hard. "I stayed because she's all I have left." Vivian shook her head. "No, you stayed because you're a good man." The words fell into him like warm stones, settling deep. "You don't know everything about me," he whispered. "Maybe not," she murmured. "But I've seen enough." Her hand moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, until her fingers brushed his. He didn't pull away. Their hands remained touching light as breath, gentle as forgiveness. It wasn't a declaration, wasn't a promise, just an invitation, a beginning. As they packed up to leave, Tessa sleepily took Vivian's hand instead of Harrison's. Vivian froze, startled. "I think she's adopted you," Harrison said softly. Vivian smiled, eyes glowing. "I could get used to that." Something warm, something dangerously close to hope spread through Harrison's chest. He had spent years living in the shadows of guilt and grief. But now, watching Vivian buckle Tessa into the car, listening to her murmur goodnight, feeling her presence linger even after she stepped back, he realized something he never expected. Healing didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came on quiet feet, wearing a navy sweater, carrying gummy bears, and holding his daughter's hand. And for the first time in years, Harrison Vale wondered if his life might have space for something more than survival. Something like love. The morning air over Harrison Vale's neighborhood carried a cool quietness, the kind that hinted at early autumn. A faint breeze brushed along the cracked sidewalks and rustling maple leaves as Harrison walked Tessa toward the school entrance. Tessa skipped beside him, her F-22 model swinging gently at her side. "Daddy, Miss V said she might come read to our class someday." Harrison smiled at her enthusiasm. "Did she now?" she said. Maybe Tessa corrected, eyes gleaming. But maybe from Miss V feels like a yes. Harrison chuckled under his breath. The truth was, Vivian Hayes had been woven into their lives so naturally, so seamlessly, that he found himself thinking in the same way when Vivian said, maybe it always sounded like the beginning of yes. He watched Tessa run into the school with a sense of pride that warmed him more than any sunrise ever had. Then, turning toward the parking lot, he spotted a familiar pair of figures leaning against a military Humvee, Vaughn Turner and Sergeant Lana Brooks. Harrison Vaughn called, lifting a hand. Harrison approached them cautiously. "Didn't expect to see you two here." "Sorry to ambush you," Vaughn said, sincerity softening his voice. "We've been trying to reach you. You didn't answer the last few texts." Harrison rubbed the back of his neck. "Busy week." Brooks exchanged a subtle glance with Vaughn. "Sir, we didn't come to bring you bad news." Harrison's heartbeat tightened. "Then what is this about?" Vaughn exhaled, choosing his words with care. "Elite Command has an opening. Tactical consulting. Hybrid schedule. On base 2 days a week. Remote and light duties the rest." Harrison stared. The words didn't make sense at first. "You're offering me a job?" "Not just any job," Brooks said with genuine respect. "We want Viper 6 back, even if it's only part-time." Harrison shook his head reflexively. "I don't fly anymore." "We're not asking you to," Vaughn said gently. "This isn't combat. It's strategy, training, oversight. You'd be mentoring younger pilots. You know things the next generation needs." Harrison stepped back, slightly overwhelmed by the sudden flood of emotion, resentment, fear, disbelief, nostalgia. "I can't go back," he muttered. "Why not?" Vaughn asked. "Because the last time I was in the sky," Harrison whispered, "I came home alone." Silence settled between them. Brooks stepped forward, her voice soft. "Sir, your wife's accident wasn't your fault." Harrison's jaw tightened. "I was supposed to protect her." Vaughn placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Harrison, you were her wingman, not her shield against fate." He closed his eyes, grief flickering behind them like a shadow he couldn't outrun. "She believed in you," Vaughn continued. "We all did. We still do." Harrison took a long breath, the tension in his chest coiling and uncoiling. He didn't know how to speak around the weight inside him. Then Vaughn said the words that finally cracked through the fear. "Tessa deserves to see her father doing what he's brilliant at, what he was born to do." Harrison's eyes snapped open. "And you deserve," Vaughn added softly, "to stop punishing yourself." That evening, Harrison found himself sitting alone on his worn couch, his fingers tracing the ridges of his steel bracelet. V6, the mark of a life he'd buried, a life he'd once lived with fire and purpose, a life that ended the day he watched his wife fall from the sky. But another life had started that same day. One centered around a little girl with a broken heart and a father who refused to break with her. He owed Tessa stability. He owed her presence. He owed her a father who stayed. But what if staying didn't mean hiding? What if staying meant rebuilding? What if Tessa grew stronger, watching him stand again? A soft knock pulled him from his thoughts. He opened the door to find Vivian Hayes standing there, her hair in a loose bun, wearing a burgundy jacket and holding 2 paper cups. "Peace offering," she said, with a soft smile handing him one. "Hot cocoa." "I figured Tessa might be asleep already." "She is," Harrison replied. Vivian stepped inside, sensing he wasn't in the brightest state of mind. "You okay?" "No," he admitted. "But maybe for the first time, I'm ready to be." She sat beside him on the couch, not too close, but close enough. "What happened?" she asked. Harrison told her everything: Vaughn's visit, the offer, the memories that came roaring back, the fear of losing himself again, if he stepped even a foot onto an airbase. Vivian listened with the kind of attention that made people feel seen to their bones. When he finished, she placed her hand on his. Steady. Warm. Unhurried. "Harrison," she said softly. "You don't have to fly to be Viper 6. He looked at her, startled. "You don't have to relive the past," she continued. "But you're allowed to reclaim the parts of yourself that were good, the parts you loved, the parts that made you who you are." He swallowed. "I'm scared." Vivian nodded. "Of course you are. That means you care." Harrison's voice cracked. "What if stepping back toward the Air Force takes me away from Tessa?" Vivian's expression softened. "And what if it shows her she has a father who survived something impossible and kept going?" He didn't realize he was trembling until she covered his hand with both of hers. "You don't have to choose between being her hero and being yourself," she whispered. "You can be both." Harrison looked away, overwhelmed. Vivian leaned closer. Her voice was barely a breath. "You're allowed to want more than survival." His eyes lifted to hers. "And you're allowed," she added gently, "to build a future that isn't shaped by grief." Harrison exhaled shakily. "I don't know how." She gave a small, tender smile. "Then let us figure it out. Together." Something inside him shifted quietly but undeniably. This wasn't pressure. This wasn't expectation. This was support. This was hope. This was a hand held out in a dark room, and an invitation to walk toward the light. Harrison squeezed her hand gently. "Tell Vaughn," he whispered. "I'll do it." Vivian's eyes glistened, not just with pride, but with something more intimate, more delicate, more deeply connected. "Good," she said softly. "You deserve this." And for the first time in years, Harrison Vale believed her. Months passed quietly, gently, with the kind of steadiness that felt like healing stitched into the fabric of daily life. The seasons shifted, and so did the rhythm of Harrison Vale's world. He no longer woke each morning, feeling the weight of absence. He no longer carried grief like an anchor chained to his ribs. He no longer walked through life only trying to survive the day. He was becoming himself again, slowly, purposefully, courageously. 3 days a week he drove to the airbase. He stepped into briefing rooms filled with young pilots who listened with reverence to every word he spoke. They called him Sir, and not because of his past rank, but because they could feel the experience in his voice, the lives saved and the wisdom he carried. And 2 days a week he worked as a janitor at the school, because that job reminded him of the years he held his daughter's world together with nothing but love and stubborn endurance. He refused to let go of that grounding, that humility, and every evening without fail, Vivian Hayes found her way into the orbit of his life. Sometimes she came over for dinner, carrying fresh groceries or a bottle of iced tea. Sometimes she arrived with books for Tessa, or quietly folded laundry Harrison had forgotten in the basket. Sometimes she simply sat on the living room floor, helping Tessa assemble impossibly complex puzzles. And some nights, Harrison found himself watching them both with a quiet fullness he didn't know how to hold. He started smiling more, laughing again, sleeping easier. And every so often he caught Vivian watching him with an expression he wasn't ready to name, but one he hoped would never fade. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Harrison, Vivian, and Tessa hiked up the gentle slope of a grassy hill just outside the airbase. The sky above was a pale blue, dotted with drifting clouds. The wind tugged lightly at their clothes as they reached the top. From here they could see the runway stretching into the horizon. Training jets roared in the distance, small silver arrows cutting through the sky. The sound didn't hollow Harrison anymore. It steadied him, rooted him, called him back in a way that felt healthy instead of haunted. Tessa bounded up the final few steps and pointed eagerly. "Daddy, Miss V, look, they're flying," Harrison smiled softly. "That's Echo Squadron. They train on Saturdays." Vivian stood beside him, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It's beautiful," she said. "It is." Harrison paused. "I didn't think I'd ever say that again." Vivian looked at him, really looked at him, and her expression softened. "You've changed, Harrison." He raised an eyebrow. "In a good way." "In the best way," she whispered. They sat together on the hill. Tessa plopped herself between them, resting her head first on Harrison's shoulder, and then on Vivian's. Vivian chuckled and wrapped an arm around the girl. The three of them, silhouetted against the open sky, looked less like a broken family, and more like one being built from gentle beginnings. A warm silence settled over them. Then, Vivian's voice drifted into the quiet. "Do you ever miss it?" Flying Harrison thought for a long moment. "I miss the sky," he admitted. "But I don't miss the pain tied to it. And now that I'm helping the new pilots, I feel like I'm contributing again, without losing myself." Vivian nodded, her hand unconsciously brushing against his on the grass. "I'm proud of you." He turned his head slightly. "Are you very?" Her voice was soft, so soft it stunned him. He wasn't sure what to do with the warmth flooding his chest. Tessa suddenly sat up. "Daddy, Miss V says pilots are brave." Harrison smiled. "She's right. And Miss V says you're brave too." Vivian flushed. I might have said something like that." Harrison looked from his daughter to Vivian, emotion tightening his voice. "I'm only brave because I have something to fight for." Vivian swallowed. "Tessa. And maybe." Harrison's voice trailed off as his gaze lingered on Vivian. "Someone else." The breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply held his gaze, steady, vulnerable, warm. They stayed like that until the low rumble of engines overhead drew their eyes upward. 4 F-22 Raptors soared past in formation, their wings catching the afternoon light like silver blades. Tessa gasped in wonder. Vivian smiled. Harrison watched with a calm he'd never felt before. Vivian leaned closer. "Do they know who you are when you're out here?" Some, Harrison admitted. "But it's different now. Respect without pressure. Recognition without expectation." "And that feels good?" she asked. He nodded. "It feels right." Vivian looked out at the sky and whispered, "You belong here, Harrison. Not in the shadows, not hiding. Here." Her words slid through him like warmth through cold metal. He exhaled slowly. "I think, for the first time in a long time." "I agree with you." Vivian turned to him with a soft, disbelieving smile. "Good." Tessa tugged on Vivian's sleeve. "Miss V, are you going to stay with us forever?" Vivian blinked, stunned. "Well, that's a big question." Harrison felt his heart leap, fear and hope blending into something fragile. Tessa persisted. "I like it when you are here." "Daddy smiles more." Vivian looked at Harrison, her eyes shimmering with emotion she had tried to keep hidden. "I like being here too." The wind brushed gently around them. A plane banked overhead, its shadow sweeping across the hill like a blessing. Vivian reached for Harrison's hand. This time he didn't hesitate. He intertwined his fingers with hers. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, wasn't rushed. It was quiet, certain healing. The kind of love that grows where grief once lived slowly, tenderly, patiently. The kind of love shaped not by grand gestures, but by steady presence. The kind of love Harrison Vale never thought he'd find again. As the sun lowered behind the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the hill, Harrison whispered the truth he had been afraid to say out loud. "I came back to the ground for Tessa. But I stay because of you." Vivian's breath trembled, and then she leaned her forehead against his eyes, closed hand gripping his like a promise. Above them, the F-22s streaked across the sky, powerful, commanding, beautiful. But Harrison Vale no longer longed for flight. He had a reason to stay, a home to build, a family to heal, and a woman whose quiet strength brought him back to life. The sky would always remember him, but now finally he had something and someone worth returning to on the ground. Love, healing, a new beginning, and peace in the quiet sky. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And which moment in this story touched your heart the most? Your comments help us understand you better and guide the stories we create next. If this video brought you comfort, inspiration, or a little hope today, feel free to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue sharing meaningful, uplifting stories every week. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We truly appreciate you, and we'll see you in the next story.